you end up having all these other benefits. Like you end up treating animals better, right? You're not being cruel to animals. You end up not poisoning your own food supply, right? You end up being able to breathe clean air.
Yeah.
So
it's a philosophical notion of just capturing more of the externalities.
Exactly.
It's saying that like we should stop just sweeping under the rug and closing our eyes and pretending it's gone. We should be more conscious.
Because when you multiply that sweeping under the rug times 8 billion people, like the jig is up, and we've been able to get away from it. But now the carpet, we're sweeping under the rug.
That's
not there. We're tripping on it.
Yeah.
Hi everybody, this is the Thinking Podcast by Nootrobox. I'm your host, Michael Brandt, and I'm here today with Josh Whiton, who's a philosopher, an entrepreneur, and a biohacker. He runs Transloc, a location logistics company that helps track vehicles as they're moving around different spaces like campuses. We'll be talking about that and more. Josh, it's great to have you.
Thanks. Glad to be here, Michael.
So you started Transloc, and that's solving the problem of transportation.
Yeah, and helping solve the bigger problem of climate change. So it turns out, if you look at what the major culprits are for climate change, transportation has actually just surpassed all the other sources of greenhouse gas emissions to be the number one leading emitter. So we've been able to clean up our power plants on this planet in the past few years more effectively than we've been able to clean up our transportation systems.
Right.
And I think we both have a background in computer science.
Yeah.
And so a few years ago, when I was looking to make an impact in the world, I looked around and saw that passenger transportation, was just not enjoying the benefits of the past 10 years of good software and computer science. And so if you can just bring that technology to a lot of this heavy infrastructure, we can really make a dent in carbon emissions.
So you're helping with things like route finding, path finding, as cars are going from one place to another?
Yeah, well, when we look at what in transportation is super broken, you'll find that public transportation has been lagging behind mass transit, that kind of thing, has been lagging behind the whole industry. And so we track thousands and thousands of buses. Essentially, we bring buses and trains and ferries and just people-moving objects, big, heavy people-moving devices, onto the Internet of Things.
So
right?
where they know things like the traffic patterns?
There's a lot of real-time information, yeah.
Okay.
So you and I could get out our mobile phones in any city that we're in,
yeah,
and look and see exactly where all the transit assets are, see where all the stops are, see the buses moving around in real time.
Right.
And that's going to take the guesswork out of it. We're going to go from saying, how would I get around this town in the least carbon efficient, least carbon producing manner, and you can look and see in real time across the country thousands of buses and trains there to serve you. So
that the big problem being solved there is access to data for the
awareness. Like you're just far less inclined. People in a city are far less inclined to take public transit if it's this huge leap of faith that there's a paper schedule somewhere that's going to tell you to go to some stop at some time.
Because you're rolling the dice. It's some big time risk. Well, there's there's a time sink in just in navigating and figuring it out, and then there's time risk that the perceived time risk that there's high variability to the duration of the trip.
Yeah.
Whereas other methods would be more predictable.
Like hopping in your car. Hopping in your car is fairly predictable, right? So in places where people are literally choosing to either take the car in their driveway or use a lower carbon manner of transportation, this technology can make all the difference. And that's just one example, but we do like a dozen different things to help overhaul the passenger transport system in America. Like even helping public transit work in a more like on-demand manner. Like what we know from Uber and Lyft is that people love being picked up where they are and dropped off where they want to go, right? That nobody wants to go to a bus stop and end up at a bus stop. That's not your destination. That's just a surrogate for some place you want to go eventually, right? And there's no reason that public transit agencies can't be picking people up where they want to go and dropping them off too, and they've got a lot of vehicles to do it. So what they're just missing is the software that Uber and Lyft have, and we can provide that to them as well. So that's another example of how we're kind of changing how transit can work in the future so that more people elect to take it.
So I think a lot of people are listening and wondering, how do you end up solving this type of problem? And in day-to-day, like what does your life look like as you're solving these problems? You like thinking about, this complex thing. There's probably a lot of stakeholders involved, a lot of different types of thinking involved in solving it. How do you like to structure your day? How do you optimize to make sure that you're thinking about the right problem, being as productive as possible, keeping the ship headed in the right direction, and not missing details?
That's a great question, and I am always trying to come up with a better answer for that.
Okay.
So I think we're both possessed with the notion of human potential, and this brings up the whole question of like, there's getting your hardware running better, getting all your neurochemicals sorted out and all that, and then there's like doing the best thing with your brain cycles. So I try to do a lot of journaling, for example, to kind of ask, like, literally dialogue with myself, like, what's the most important thing to do today, right? Yeah. Delegating, right? I actually handed off my company to a CEO several years ago because that operating role wasn't what I wanted to do on a daily basis. And so there's a lot smaller chance that I'd be here on this podcast having a great time with you and hopefully, offering something useful to all those people out there if I were just engaged in the day-to-day operating role of that. So delegation, teamwork, I don't know. It's a great question, though. Hopefully we can get to a better answer as this goes on.
Yeah. What do you do to feel your best? You've talked about things like protein-restricted diet. You've talked about a lot of interesting experiments that you've done on yourself with diet or lifestyle choices. Yeah. And I'm curious to hear like what you've decided, what's made the final cut, what's part of your routine.
What has made the final cut? I have tried a lot more things than I would say have made the final cut. So for sure, obviously.
What are some interesting things you've tried?
Like I was, donating a lot of blood for a while, right, to lower my ferritin levels and stuff like that.
Okay. And what's the notion there?
The notion there is that the less iron that's essentially floating around your body, then the less oxidation will happen. And we don't need but so much iron in our body, and we're living longer than ever, so there's just the possibility that we're just accumulating iron unnecessarily, right?
Interesting.
And we also don't like get in bloody battles as much anymore. We live kind of gentle lives, and so so we have to cope with, as we live longer and all this stuff, there are evolutionarily, regulated mechanisms that don't really know what to do with
all this blood that we're not.
Well, in a lifespan that is just so long in general now, right? So I was doing that for a while, but then.
And then we're donating, basically donating blood is the only way to get rid of excess iron.
It's the cheapest way to get rid of excess iron that's stored up in your blood. But then the reason I stopped doing it, it's pretty. We don't know. It's going to take a long time before we know what the ideal iron levels are in the body.
Right.
It's going to take a long time before we understand whether this theory about the oxidization of the iron even matters, and then moreover, you're triggering your body to have to create a lot of new blood cells.
Right.
And so, as you get older, you generally want to minimize the events of cell division and replication that you're triggering, because the copying errors just get worse and worse over time. So I've tried, again, this is an example of something that I love coming up with theory and then giving a go for a while. But I've done that. I've done neurofeedback. What are the optimal brainwaves, to have going for different tasks? Explored altered states of all kinds. What are altered states good for? Therapy, like dealing with baggage that we have, emotional baggage, bad experiences from our past, right? They're all just rattling around in there. Yeah. And so, sure, you can get your mind working very quick and very alert and all this, but the software might be crap that you're running, right? Yeah. So how to tweak that software.
And how do you measure these things? Or is it, for you, a more intuitive sense? Because one of the things that it would seem to make sense to do if you're bloodletting is like to have some metric you're measuring that against, or for some of the more ephemeral stuff or like personality, mood stuff, that can be admittedly harder to measure objectively, but there's still ways of measuring it, perhaps. I mean, you mentioned journaling. I'm curious to get a sense of, like, as you're trying these things, how do you really know what's working versus not? Like, how do you...
It's really hard to know until you get there.
Yeah.
Right. And so you can look at your telomeres and all this kind of stuff, the biomarkers of aging. But it is much more subjective and also much quicker to just check in and see, like, how do I feel? Like maybe you're sleeping too much and you have a loss of energy. And is that a matter of getting onto a nootropic regimen? Sure, give it a shot, modifying your diet.
Yeah.
But also, for example, if you like don't have enough purpose in your life, like you're just not jazzed about what you do for a living, you might want to address that. Right. Because your mind, powerful as it is not going to ignore the fact that you don't think what you do for 50 hours a week matters.
Right. And no enhancement's going to affect that. That's right. That's there's no nootropic that's going to solve it. There's no implant that's going to solve it.
I think this is where you get into the anti-nootropic of like drinking beer every day at 6 p.m. Right? It's the opposite. You're trying to like you're not addressing it, so you go into like escapism.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, that escapism would be the opposite of self-actualization.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, we had a whole episode with my co-host who's currently out of town, and we talked about hard work as a means towards self-actualization, about how to discover who you are and to find your identity. You basically have to try a bunch of things out, be very playful and exploratory, feel what works, what you're good at, what you're not, what you like doing, what you don't. And you're always in play mode and kind of like building out your identity as you're seeing yourself almost from the outside. But it takes hard work. And you have to have something that you actually care 110% about and then mean it. And then that's how this process of self-discovery happens. And it's interesting that you'd mentioned that sometimes that's what needs to be fixed, right? Like if we're thinking about bioenhancement, it's like sometimes the first question is, well, what's really broken or what really needs fixing? Because sometimes it might be a matter of adjustment. And so then that actually invites an interesting question, which is that should there be a sense of restricting enhancement to people who are already at a certain level of psychological wellness, where in the ideal world we would have people doing enhancement technologies when they need it, rather than to patch up something that might be more psychological or spiritual or whatever. It might be a matter of disposition. And then who's making that call?
Yeah, regulating that is going to be obviously a problem. But what we're, I think, all in agreement about is that we want to prioritize things properly, right? And there have been times when I've been meticulously monitoring carbohydrate intake or something, right? When maybe I had a relationship problem that I wasn't addressing, right? And so I've got like I'm looking for a productivity enhancement, like 0.001 power up, and I have this energy emotion drain -30 thing going on in my life that I'm not addressing, right? So just prioritizing them properly. And I did listen to that episode that you just mentioned, and just a few thoughts there. Abraham Maslow refers to your self-actualizing work. I just love that phrase. Like, there's endless amount of work out there to do. What is your self-actualizing work? Like, what is the task that when you engage in it, like, you become the next version of yourself, right? And for me, that turned out to be entrepreneurship. So as much as I love thinking and writing and having experiences of all kinds, when I looked at where is my self-actualizing work, being an entrepreneur, that intersection of practically providing something to a market, addressing a need.
So I'm curious. So for you, it's entrepreneurship. I'm sure there's other types of pursuits that fulfill the self-actualization in other people that you've seen. What are those types of things, and what are some of the characteristics that those all share?
The most general and useful thing that I would offer as a framework is that it's almost like you've got this blueprint inside of yourself that's wants to be built, right? It's just plans for like a self-actualized you.
Yeah.
And then the experiences you engage in around you, your work, your relationships to everything, your relationships to food, your relationships to nutrients, everything around you is a potential raw material for the build out of yourself.
Right.
So even with the blueprint means that what you ultimately fill the blueprint spec with, like, it's going to be colored by all those things, right?
Yeah.
So people self-actualizing, I think, to your point, can look different in different people's lives.
Yeah. And you're saying entrepreneurship's an activity for you that helps you to discover the blueprint.
Yeah, and to fulfill the manifest. Like, it's just, if you set out to make a difference.
Yeah. Which is cool. I'm just curious, what other types of things for you? It's entrepreneurship. For other people, what are other types?
It's everything. I mean, you've got great programmers out there. You've got people doing volunteer work. You've got scientists. You've got.
And what is the thread? What is the thread? Like, what ties it? Is there a certain type of activities in particular, or is it?
I think that's the crux of the matter, is that it is not easy to reduce into a hard and fast rule at a specific level. So it's just about getting your needs met, your legitimate needs met, right?
Right.
And that brings up this whole other conversation, because society has, for a little while now, been sort of more of a wants-based kind of culture. Perhaps you look at most marketing is kind of geared toward wants, convincing you want something, and then
right.
convincing you have to have it, you know. Uh-huh. But if we take a really kind of needs-based approach, what I might need, you know, in my professional career next is to really go make a difference in helping with something like climate change, one of the, you know, greatest challenges we're facing as a species right now. But what somebody else might need right now is a friend or a different peer group, or to backpack across Europe, or who knows what, right? And so you can't look at that person and say, you should be doing this thing I'm doing, necessarily. It's just about, are they engaging in something that is meeting their legitimate physical or psychological, psycho-spiritual needs, whatever you want to call it. So that's why it's so varied, and we've had a hard time.
It's interesting, because I would take a strong opinion there and say that there is something special about hard work and building something in creation that's distinct from like backpacking or traveling or kind of like taking things in, but that there's this affirmative notion of creation that is special, where by doing it you something novel happens that doesn't happen when you're not doing it.
Yeah.
You're literally taking your ideas and your sense of order and justice and whatever in the world, and you're expanding it out, and that's very cool.
But there's age appropriate versions of that, I guess, is what I'm saying, right? Yeah. So exactly what you just said, I could think of that as like this hard charging, self-actualizing entrepreneur in their 20s or 30s or something, and I could equally think of like a 4-year-old building a Lego tower. They're both engaging in their self-actualizing work. That's all I'm saying. And so for a 15-year-old to like travel to another country where they don't know the language and where they're without their parents, that might be their self-actualizing work in that moment. That's all. But ultimately, we're not going to solve the world with Legos and 5-year-olds, right? Like we have some serious challenges and creative acts that we want to see increasingly age appropriate and increasingly amazing and all that stuff.
Yeah. And it's cool. I think that we're at a special time in human history where there's more people that are in a position to solve problems like this than ever before. Yeah. And I think it's like millions of times more because 150 years ago, a lot of people were having to do basic things like farming and blacksmithing, and right now that's taken up by a very small, 2% of people, 2% of the population. Mm-hmm. And so we've opened up a lot of abundance where I think of as a society, we're moving up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where there's fewer people who are responsible for the basic things like food, shelter, safety. Like a lot of houses are built, a lot of food supply chain is already established. And so what we have is millions, tens of millions of people who are of this who are intellectuals. You would consider them like they're basically, the easy way to understand it is a lot of their productive work spent staring at a glowing rectangle. Yeah. Right. Like, and there's millions of people, and the reason that that's actually a good definition is because like when you're staring at your glowing rectangle, you're dealing in abstractions and symbolic systems, and it's like spreadsheets and logos and concepts and things like it's abstract and it's intellectual. And I think that gives what that means is that there's a large group of people who are solving bigger problems than ever before. That for every Isaac Newton, right, if we had one Isaac Newton in the 19th century that today there's 100 of them alive and plugged in.
There's also more people, I don't know, playing Farmville or Pokemon Go or something than ever before too, right? So it's almost like everything is more than ever before. You know? But one
that's interesting. It cuts both ways.
And we do have this problem that you can see now with if you like cruise through the spirituality scene or the mindfulness scene or whatever, like people struggling with things like busy mind, right? Like what does the mind that has the luxury of thinking about anything think about? And we didn't used to have that luxury necessarily. Right. It's like winter's coming. Let's get with it.
Get on your damn horse, get some wood. We never had time to lie idle.
Yeah, and now we have existential crises instead, where it's just like, what do I do? Why? What's worth doing? That kind of stuff. So I do like that.
How are we going to deal with that? Because I think on the one hand we have people we have individuals who are tackling transportation systems or climate change broadly. Like we have individuals who are wielding massive leverage because of this this abundance where you don't have to gather firewood for the coming winter, and yet at the same time we're also seeing existential ennui or existential there's an emptiness where you're not compelled by purpose to haul the fireworks, so what the fuck am I doing? Like what am I?
And you don't want your parents' job necessarily or what their framework for meaning was.
And so how are we going to solve that as a society? Like what's how are you going to figure this out?
I'm hoping I can help solve it by being on this podcast right
now.
So one thing that I notice as a broad pattern for just people out there who are wondering with this question, like what is some of the most important things I can be doing with my life, because I think we need meaning. We have to run on meaning as one of those essential nutrients, right?
Yeah.
And I am somebody who has gone and explored not just what technology can do and problems like transportation, but how nature works, problems of pollution. I mean, climate change is like a carbon CO2 pollution problem, really, right? Loss of biodiversity. We have all these things that are happening to the planet right now. And when you look at solving them, what you find is that there are just not enough people actually working on them and working on them in the right way. And what I mean by that is you might have an ecologist or an environmentalist looking at biodiversity and loss of species in oceans. We have huge coral reef die-offs right now because of climate change and temperature swells. You don't have so many engineers and computer scientists looking at those problems. So there's so much opportunity right now to take skills from one domain and to apply them to another. Like the quote we were talking about earlier, that the future is already here, but it's not evenly distributed.
Right.
So there's just huge leverage points.
So it's interesting when you say that, because you're saying that a mass amount of workers should move from this industry to that industry, and I would say
not move, but integrate.
Oh, I would say then where's
cross-train, intersect.
Where's the finance? Where's the financing coming from? Because there's people. Facebook can employ engineers because Facebook sells hella ads.
Yeah.
Climate change has a harder time employing engineers because there's less of a natural capitalist business model built around solving it. And so I guess to answer my own question, I would say that I'm not the first to say this, but that a Manhattan Project or Apollo Project scale of government allocation of resources would be the thing to solve this, to help to reallocate thinkers from fields that are currently very well capitalized to fields that are not well capitalized, but which represent problems that society ought to solve.
That's one model, but we know that capitalism and markets actually work pretty well.
Okay.
So long as there aren't unpriced externalities.
Right. And climate change is not priced properly.
Right. Loss of biodiversity is not priced properly.
And so I guess just to a little background, I think we know the term, but just to expand on the notion of priced, externalities, what do you mean?
Sure. When you buy something, the company has generally tried to get the lowest manufacturing costs so that there's the highest margin.
Sure.
And so what they've had to do is sort of sweep under the rug every possible thing that they can get away with not thinking about.
Right.
So what happens to their trash? How are people disposing of this product that they sell them? Is that ending up in the air? Is that turning into air pollution that then leads to massive health problems? Or is what they're manufacturing leading to an epidemic of diabetes that then creates this, takes a lot of who could be productive people, like lessens their productivity hugely, creates whole sort of illegitimate industries to sort of just help them exist in a kind of low productive way. And biodiversity. Like biodiversity is, if you think about it, it is the substrate of evolution. Like when you look at when evolution really got off on this exponential curve, it's as there are just more living things interacting with more living things, right? So we haven't even come to fully appreciate what all the other animals and microbes and fungi and all these things on the planet even do for us. So we haven't seen another phrase that almost nobody in Silicon Valley ever hears is ecosystem services. Like there are services being provided by the ecosystem for free all the time, because it's all solar powered and gravity powered and all that kind of thing, that our life actually depends on, our way of life depends on. But we have been able to sweep that under the rug for a lot of years and just not worry about it, right?
So basically when a factory is making a toy and they might have an option between doing something that's high pollution and cheap, low pollution and expensive, they'll do the high pollution and cheap one to save money, pass it on to the end customer, but
and pass on the problems to society.
And pass on this, right, which we're all paying for. Or sometimes it's not evenly distributed. The person buying the toy is not affected by the pollution, but the person who lives in the city where the factory exists, in lower income situation, that person is affected. So there's a lot of stratification that gets worsened. And so the notion is you have to capture that externality. It should be really expensive to pollute. There should it should be expensive to do that, or to acquire energy from coal versus solar power. Like we should maybe make coal more expensive to obtain. The quick counter to that is always that, that's going to slow down our economy in general. It's more taxes. It's more perfectly well operating businesses are going to grind to a halt because basic things like energy and materials that they've been getting that are baked in are going to just skyrocket in cost when we start baking in these externalities. So it's expensive to account for these things.
In the near term, not in the long term.
Right. In the long term, it's the right move. Yep.
And so this is why we need nootropics, making people as smart as possible. We can start taking the long-term view, right? Yeah. So for example, economy has to mean something other than how successfully can the human race turn the planet into garbage and cash.
Right.
Because when you multiply that kind of mistake, all these unpriced externalities, times 8 billion people, they show up. And that's what we're beginning to encounter now is, I don't know who said it, but we used to think you could throw stuff away. Turns out there is no way.
Yeah.
It ends up in your fishing lines. There it is again.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think another interesting point to consider while we're on this topic is what about different nations though? Because I think that there's always this kind of gamesmanship where if our country taxes more on pollution and unclean energy, then that's great, but then China's going to keep doing what it's doing. India is going to do what it's doing. Brazil, Nigeria, right? All these countries that are growing quickly are going to continue to industrialize in dirty ways, and then the United States we're going to be really well behaved and clean and have a lagging economy. So that there would perhaps.
But maybe we can breathe our air, and that's nice.
Yeah, but it's still the tragedy of the commons where pollution is global, temperature change is global. So
which is a great example. Which is a great time for the technologists and the keepers of the interwebs to come in and shed light on these kind of heinous externalities, right? So you see, again, I'm lobbying for the intersection of all these powerful communications and
I do think that one of the things that's going to continue to happen is that the consumers will want to know more about things, that people will actually more and more put their dollars towards things that are better for the planet. Because when people have wealth, when people have abundance, they want to put that towards meaning. They want to build a sense of identity, right? That cure for that existential ennui, that sense of, what am I doing? One way to solve it is putting your money towards things that you believe in, buying more expensive things because they support something real. That can give you a sense of identity. Granted, it's still it's still consuming rather than creating. But I do think that for a lot of
depends on what you're consuming. You might be consuming conservation. You might buy 1,000 acres of land and then like keep a factory from being built there and do something better with it. Right. So we want to shift consuming though to not mean treating the planet entirely like a raw material and not at all like an ecosystem. And there is a way to consume that way.
Yeah, and I think that's incredible. And I think that when we're in that state, that there's people are going to want to be able to modulate their cognition, have the best control, be able to mood regulate, be able to have good productivity. Like if people are more in this cerebral state, they're going to want different ways of improving themselves. One last thing I wanted to end on was just a really interesting blog post that you wrote about how you consider money as a neurotransmitter. And I thought that was just really succinct analogy. I was curious, can you kind of unpack it a bit for us? What do you mean by that?
So I like to use very reasonable, rational ways to sort of back your way into a more cosmic sort of spiritual perspective, not just unreasonable ways, right? And so if you look at biological patterns we see in all of nature, actually, we see that complex things are made up of simple things. It's how atoms make molecules, blah blah blah. Cells made of organelles create organs, blah blah blah. And you have neurons making up a brain, and we know that the mind is somehow closely related to the brain, right? I'm pretty sure of that. And so what's funny is that we're very comfortable taking this sort of view of emergent complexity, starting with our mind and looking downward. We're like looking through a microscope and saying, oh, look at my cells, that's neat. Oh, they're made up of smaller things, that's neat. Oh, what are atoms made of? That's neat. But we get really skittish when we start, or we have a defense against thinking about, what am I just a small thing in? And so and it's almost a definition of an ego defense, right? Like I want to think like I'm the top layer, right? The top level. But clearly we're not. Like we have words that we denote that we're not. We have culture, society, government. We see these functional units, almost like functional regions in the brain emerge. And so when you look at humans as neurons interacting with each other. So I'm just
imagining like the time-lapse video of a city, and you see cars moving everywhere.
Yeah, those are synapses. We help people. So this is why I get kind of excited about even something as like transportation. Like, is it just buses and trains, or are these synapses in the global brain? Like that person.
There's organ systems, like electricity, transportation. Like these are just different organ systems of this.
That's right. They're different organ systems. And if you start taking that biological perspective, then money starts to look a lot like a neurotransmitter. There's a lot of different forms of it. It transacts pretty quickly. It facilitates these exchanges between people. And in the body, we have over 100 neurotransmitters, right? And the reason I got to thinking about that was because I started thinking about the explosion in currencies with cryptocurrencies, right? You went from just kind of a one-to-one mapping of nation states to money, and then you have this explosion suddenly. And what do those cryptocurrencies allow us to do? They allow us to have more robust interactions, transnational, global exchanges, right? So it was just kind of a fun moment where I took this sort of what's going on in nature from this level down, and what would that mean if it were going from this level up? And so, but a punchline in there that kind of ties into what you guys do is that once you realize money is sort of this neurotransmitter, what should you be doing with it, right? Because that's a whole nother level. It's like, oh, and I control some of it, right? And you can literally take money and squirt it in a direction and get somebody to do a unit of work. That's an incredible power. None of us are entirely impervious to it, right?
Right.
So let's start spending that money in ways that enhance our own consciousness, our own performance. Let's spend that money in ways that improve the relationship between things like business, technology, nature, economy, right? We have agency here. And the more conscious we are, the more agency we have.
That's awesome. Yeah. I want to say thanks for your time, Josh. It's been an awesome episode. And just real quick, where can people learn more about you?
Sure, they can find me at my website, joshwhitten.com, Whiton. I'm the only Josh Whitten out there who spells it that way, or on Twitter at Josh Whitten, or Medium at Josh Whitten. I'll keep blogging as often as I can.
Awesome. Well, thanks.
Thank you, Michael.
And for everyone out there, you can check out our podcast on YouTube. We're on SoundCloud and iTunes, and share it with a friend. Thanks for joining us. Bye.